Vintage Custom Ducati 500cc Desmo Bevel Gear Motorcycle.
This episode of On the Bench features a 1958 Ducati 500cc engine that came out of a custom racing bike designed to compete in vintage races. The upper bevel gear bearing has failed, and an improved replacement is in the works. This video is part 1 with an overview of the motorcycle, bevel gear fitment, and bearing failure info. On this custom racing motorcycle, the frame, tank, and seat were fabricated by Jim Robb, so it's a Robb special. The motor started out as a 450cc Ducati Desmo that has been modified with an aftermarket cylinder and piston set from Marcello Peruzzi to have close to 500 cc's. The motor has had many other performance-oriented modifications, so the motor is a Peruzzi Ducati Special. Marcello worked in the racing department at the Ducati factory for many years. This bike was designed to compete in vintage series races within the rules established by Oregon Motorcycle Road Racing Association, OMRRA, and American Historic Motorcycle Road Racing Association, AHMRRA.
Racing transmission that was built in England in it, and it's got square cut primary gears. It's got an oversized piston. It did have an eccentric crank pin in it for. It's got a unique cylinder that was cast in Italy. It's Nickel plated, and the clutch is made up of stock steel clutch plates and a mixture of clutch plates that I got from Barnett's, stock clutch plates. And because with the stock clutch plates, I couldn't get the thing to, it was making so much power that I couldn't keep it from slipping. And Barnett's, they were kind enough to send me a set of clutch plates to actually get the thing to work. Well, it's cast aluminum with a Nickel cylinder lining. There's this motor's good. It has been. There's all kinds of things that are different about it from the stock motor. And the last time I had it on a dyno, it was making 41 horsepower at the rear wheel, which is probably close to 50 horsepower at the crank, which is plenty for a motor that old. That is a high volume oil pump that was made by Marcello Peruzzi in Italy.
That?
Yep. And the cylinder was also cast for Marcello Peruzzi, and the pistons were made for him by Asso. And it's and this motor started out with an eccentric crank pin in it too, which put it out to a much higher cc. The Nigel from Lacey Ducati, and pass on to him some of the things that I've learned. I mean, he's built so many of these engines. I'm sure he's familiar with the concepts behind this motor, because if he's been involved in racing in Europe, he knows who Marcello Peruzzi is. A lot of the changes that I made to this motor were based on Peruzzi's input and parts that I got from him.
Yeah, that's cool.
And I'm sure motors that he's built have raced against motors that Marcello built.
So there's one. So is it just one bearing that is the one of concern, or is it a couple?
Well, this bearing is the one that has failed, and because I haven't had a failure on the one that is down here, where is it? This set right here. There's two bearings in here. There's this bearing and this bearing, which are similar. They're not self-aligning bearings, because this is a straight shaft that is held in place, held rigidly inside these cages. But they're a similar type of bearing, and And because I haven't had any failures there, I don't think that I'm going to use the polyamide cages in these. But in this one, I'm definitely going to. Well, there's a set of bearings down here that hold the lower part of the shaft structure that goes from this bevel gear. See, this bevel gear right here is similar to this one, and it's attached. It's machined from a shaft, so it's a one piece, and the shaft comes up and it goes into what's called a heim joint in here, which is just a sleeve that fits the two cut halves of the shafts together so that they mate right there. It's just the opposite of that. And then it drives the camshaft up here, and the camshaft has a similar bevel gear on it right there, and it drives that camshaft at the top.
Oh, okay.
And then this is the bearing that came apart, and it was an NSK, and it's a self-aligning bearing, and it looks, here's a used one that is still in good shape. But what's unique about it is when they say it's self-aligning, it means that, you know, the shaft does not have to be absolutely true in order to be able to utilize the bearing. So you can see that the bearing has got a certain amount of, you can manipulate it around. And this one is one that goes at the top of the tower shaft. And then they're all shimmed to where you can set up the bevel gears with engineer's bluing and a lot of assembly and disassembly to get the gear engagement to be absolutely zero lash and zero interference, because these gears are machined as sets. Like this gear and the gear on the top of that bevel shaft over there are machined as sets, and they come as sets, and if you don't, you know, mix them up, then they are designed to be meshed pretty much perfectly. This gear are machined as a set, and they also, you know, if you keep the gear sets together, then you can set them up to where the mesh is really good. But it takes you know, shimming the things right and putting it together and taking it apart. You've got to, you know, basically put everything together and torque it down, and then measure it with engineer's bluing. On one, you put that on one bevel gear, and then spin the motor and see where it transfers to the other bevel gear. And if you've got good engagement, it shows up. And if you've got poor engagement, you know, the bluing will rub off. And
Okay.
And if it binds up, you'll feel it, because when you set these up, you don't set this one. You set up without this gear on, so that this gear and the gear up here and the camshaft will all spin together, and you can actually feel when you spin it, because there's no resistance, there's no rockers in the motor. You basically just got the camshaft in there, so you're not opening and closing any valves, and you can feel if it binds up anywhere. And you want to get it to the point where it doesn't bind up anywhere, and where there is as little movement in the gears that are shimmed as possible. And it's a process. On a bevel gear, see, these are helical cut bevel gears, which means that it's got a curve to it.
Right.
And they match up as a curve. So you want to make sure that the gear engagement is in the middle of the gear. So when you put, like if you put bluing material on the tower shaft gear and transfer it to this gear, you want to see all of that bluing transferred not to the outside, not to either outside edge, but to the middle of the gear. You know.
Okay.
And they actually, the way that they end up working is that you know, the bluing, if it's done correctly, actually transfers from about there on the gear to there on the gear, and the outside edges don't actually make contact. That's the way that it should work. And if you've got it misaligned, then it's going to either be all the way out to here or all the way out to here and stop, you know, somewhere in there. So it's getting the thing lined up in a precision way. It's really doable, and it's pretty straightforward how you do it with shims and stuff and the bluing, but it just takes a lot of assembly and disassembly. If you've got a misalignment, then you've got to, you know, adjust the shim pack to get the thing right. And this is a bearing that I found. I was thinking about using it. I found it at a warehouse out in New York that is a FAG 1202C4, which is a little bit looser clearance than a C3 bearing. I mean, C3 and C4 overlap a little bit, but it would be a little bit looser fit. And I was thinking for a while that possibly putting a C3 bearing in there, when I was thinking that it might have been heat that was causing the things to, these cages to break up, then I was thinking that maybe if I had a looser bearing, a C4 rather than a C3 in there, that would make a difference. But there's absolutely no sign that it was heat. I mean, the races on these things are, you know, I haven't examine them under a microscope, but under a magnifying glass, they look like there's nothing unusual. The only wear that I could find was on this face, and that's where it sits against one of the shims. And these are a loose enough fit that they can spin on the shaft. So this part of the race can spin slightly, whereas the other race that is enclosed in this race can't spin at all because it's a press fit. But these are the cages. You can see what the cage is made up of. This one is a steel cage that holds the balls in place so they don't fall out. And it's just a stamped steel cage. And hopefully with the polyamide, you know, my big worry on the polyamide is temperature, because the polyamide bearings are designed to operate optimally up to 120 degrees centigrade, 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And the motor should operate within that range most of the time, but in a racing motor, you're going to go over that temperature from time to time, possibly up to 300 degrees. And I haven't actually measured oil temperature or the temperature of this part of the cylinder head where this bearing is mounted, but it's close enough to the exhaust port that transfer is going to be pretty significant to the metal components. And the exhaust port is what gets the hottest on a cylinder head. And I was lucky enough to have a conversation with a chemical engineer last night, and she said that she works with polymers a lot, and she said that it's true that the polyamide will deteriorate more rapidly as it goes beyond its optimal operating range, but that it's not going to be a sudden thing where if it goes above 250 degrees, the thing is going to disintegrate. It's going to begin to weaken, and the more often you do that, the weaker it's going to become. And if you know that, and you know that this is a racing engine, you've got to get into it every so often. The bearings, cost $30, so it's not a big deal to replace the bearings. Setting the thing up and getting it all correct is the hard part. But once you've got it correct, you're pretty likely to have a good setup with a new bearing on it, because the bearing measurements are pretty consistent with the thickness of the bearings. The polyamide bearings have been around for a long time, and I actually thought about using them, over a decade ago when I found out about them, but because the manufacturers put the optimal operating temperature at below 250 degrees Fahrenheit, I decided not to use them. This guy that I've been corresponding with in England, he owns Ducati, which is a very reputable, well-known English Ducati shop, and he's been using these things basically for 30 years, the polyamide bearings, and he's been using them not only in street motors but in racing motors too. So, and he says he's never had a failure, and he's incredibly meticulous in how he sets things up, probably more meticulous than I am. And a lot of it, I'm sure, has to do with his assembly processes. Because I'm ready to give it a shot. One of the biggest reasons is that if I do experience a failure, it's not going to be nearly as catastrophic as having a metal cage disintegrate, and dump itself down into the crankcase, because that means you've got to replace every single bearing, whereas if you've got a polyamide and fiberglass cage that disintegrates or melts, it's going to be far less, unless it clogs oil lines. I mean, that's one consideration, is that you could clog oil lines with it. But hopefully the filtration on the bottom, it's got a little mesh filter in the bottom of the engine, that would keep anything large enough to cause a problem in the oil passages out. Yeah, when I drained the oil out of it the last time I raced it, I was just absolutely disgusted, because out with the oil came these little bits. I mean, this is what I just pulled when I pulled the timing side cover off. These were still sitting in there, but these little bits were all over, And I'm sure that when I split the cases, I'm going to find more of them. But, it's just work.
Right. Yeah.